Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And this is the fifth edition. Okay. Well, I hope you guys are all enjoying this book. We are starting a brand new chapter. This is going to be chapter 20, part 1. And in the meantime, you could check out our other book clubs. We have the spiritual book clubs on Monday and health book clubs on Wednesdays. And then we put out a monthly newsletter that we put out for free. You guys can check that out on our website. And also check out our podcast. We interview different interesting people. I think they're interesting anyways. Um, about different topics and things like that. So you could check that out. Also check out our YouTube channel as well. We have the previous books that we've read, we put it on the YouTube channel. So you guys can download that and listen to it when you're in the gym or in the car or in traffic or whatever. And if you are local in the LA area, come visit us in person. We have a healing center. We use technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing for animals and humans. So check that out too. And if you find this valuable and you want to support us, you can buy me a coffee and support us that way. I would appreciate it very, very much. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking with us. This particular book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is a very large book. So if you've made it this far, good for you. You are one of the few people who likes to read like me. So kudos to you. All right. And lastly, if you have any books you want to recommend for us to read, I'll leave a link in the description box below, and you can make that suggestion, and we will read it at our discretion. So, all right, let's do this. I'm going to move the camera in a little bit. If you have a book, you can follow with us there. If not, you can follow with us here on the camera. And we are on section 5 of the book, The Harvest. Monetary and political scientists continue to expound the theoretical merits of the Federal Reserve System. It has become a modern act of faith that economic life simply could not go on without it. But the time for theory is past. The creature moved into its final lair in 1913 and has snorted and thrashed about the landscape ever since. If we wish to know if it is a creature of service or a beast of prey, we merely have to look at what it has done. More like a beast of prey. Now, it's very interesting, just a side note here, that the author described it as a creature of service or a beast of prey. And that depends on the people who are using it as a vehicle. So the way, so what he's saying is that money or the banking system is a tool. It's the way we as human beings, as conscious uh, human beings, right? It's the way that we use it. Is it for good, for service, or is it for bad as a beast of prey? And that goes the same with any technology, whether it's AI, even like cell phones, social media, same thing. Okay. All right, just a little side note there. And after the test of all those years, we can be sure that what it has done, it will continue to do. Or to use the biblical axiom, a tree shall be known by the fruit it labored. A tree shall be known by the fruit it bears. Let us now examine the harvest. Okay, chapter 20. The London Connection. The Rise of the House of Morgan Morgan's ties with England, and the House of Rothschild. The connection between the Federal Reserve System and the Bank of England. The Fed's decision to inflate American dollars to assist the ailing British economy. The period between the Civil War and the enactment of the Federal Reserve System was one of the great economic volatility and no small measure of chaos. The National Banking Acts of 1863 to 65 established a system of federally chartered banks, which were given significant privilege and power over the monetary system. They were granted a monopoly in the issuance of bank notes, and the government agreed to accept those notes for the payment of taxes and duties. They were allowed to back this money up to 90% with government bonds instead of gold. And they were guaranteed that every bank in the system would have to accept the notes of every other bank at face value, regardless of how shaky their position. The net effect was that the banking system of the United States after the Civil War, far from being free and unregulated, as some historians have claimed, was literally a halfway house to central banking. The notion of being able to generate prosperity simply by creating more money has always fascinated politicians and businessmen. But at no time in our history was it more in vogue than in the second half of the 19th century. The nation had gone mad with the Midas complex, a compulsion to turn everything into money through the magic of banking. Personal checks gradually had become accepted in commerce just as readily as banknotes, and the banks obliged their customers by entering into their passbooks just as many little numbers as they cared to, quote, borrow. As Gross Close observed, the manna of cheap money became the universal cry. And as with the Israelites, the easier the manna was acquired, the louder became the complaint, the less willing the people to struggle for it. And that quote was from, let's see here, sorry about that. Gross Close, Money and Man, page 202. The prevailing philosophy at that time was aptly expressed by J. Cook, the famous financier who had marketed the huge Civil War loans for the federal government and who now was raising $100 million for the Northern Pacific Railroad. Cook had published a pamphlet which was aptly summarized by its own title, How Our National Debt May Be a National Blessing. The debt is public wealth, political union, protection of industry, secure basis for national currency. Why, asked Cook, should this grand and glorious country be stunted and dwarfed, its activities chilled and its very lifeblood curdled by these miserable hard coin theories, the musty theories of a bygone age? And that quote was quoted by Rothbard, Mystery, page 231. As it turns out, however, the chilling and curdling game, not from the musty hard coin theories of the past, but from the glittering easy money theories of the present. The Northern Pacific went bankrupt, and as the mountain of imaginary money invested in it collapsed back into nothing, Cook's giant investment Cook's giant investment firm disappeared along with it, triggering the Panic of 1873 as it went. Matthew Josephson writes, all about the failure of J. Cook's newsboys hawked throughout the country. The largest and most pious bank in the Western world had fallen with the effect of a thunderclap. Soon, allied brokers and national banks and 5,000 commercial houses followed it into the abyss of bankruptcy. All day long in Wall Street, one suspension after another was announced. Railroads failed, leading stocks lost 30 to 40 points and or half their value. Within the hour, immeasurable waves of fear altered the movement of greed. The exchanges were closed, the stampede, the greatest crisis in history, was on. And that was from Matthew Josephson, the Robber Barons, the Great American Capitalist, 1861 to 1901. New York, Harcourt Brace Yovanovitch, 1934, page 170. And still more booms and busts. Altogether, there were four major contractions of the money supply during this period. The so-called panics of 1873, 1884, 1893, and 1907. Each of them was characterized by inadequate bank reserves and the suspension of specie payment. Congress reacted not by requiring an increase in reserves, which would have improved the safety margin, but by allowing a decrease. I don't know if these people are stupid or if they're just, or what, or ignorant, or just, I don't know. Anyways, it's just kind of weird reading that. And these are people running our country. Oh, sorry. Little squirrel there. In June of 1874, legislation was passed which permitted the banks to back their notes entirely with government bonds. That, of course, meant more fiat money for Congress. But it also meant that banknotes no longer had any specie banking at all, not even 10%. I don't think these people have any common sense. At least that's the way I read it. Uh, This released over $20 million from bank reserves, which then could be used as the basis for pyramiding even more checkbook money into the economy. It has become accepted mythology that these panics were caused by seasonal demands for farm loans at harvest time. To supply those funds, the country banks had to draw down their cash reserves, which generally were deposited with larger city banks. This thinned out the reserves held in the cities, and the whole system became more vulnerable. Actually, that part of the legend is true, but apparently no one is expected to ask questions about the rest of the history. Several of them come to mind. Why wasn't there a panic every autumn instead of just every 11 years or so? Interesting, eh? Like clockwork, 11 years. Why didn't all banks, country or city, maintain adequate reserves to cover their depositors' demands? And why didn't they do this in all seasons of the year? Why would merely saying no to some loan applicants cause hundreds of banks to fail? The myth falls apart under the weight of these questions. The truth is that if it hadn't been seasonal demand by agriculture, the money magicians simply would have found another scapegoat. It would have been, quote, immobile reserves, lack of elasticity in the money supply, imbalance of international payments, or some other technocratic smokescreen to cover the real problem, which was and always has been fractional reserve banking itself. The bottom line was that in spite of an elaborate scheme to pool the minuscule reserves of country banks into larger regional banks, where they could be rushed from town to town like kegs of coins on the old frontier, it still didn't work. The loaves and fishes stubbornly refused to multiply. Morgan prospers when others fail. The monetary expansions and contractions of this period were large waves that capsized thousands of investment ships at sea. But there was one large vessel that somehow bobbed up and down with the surges quite well and could be seen throughout the storm. Salvaging the abandoned cargoes and those that were in distress. This vessel brought back to port untold riches that once had been the property of others, but now belonged to the master of the salvaged ship in accordance with the rules of the high sea. The captain's name was J.P. Morgan. It will be recalled from a previous section that J.P. Morgan and company was no small player in the world chess match called World War I. Morgan had been chosen by the French and British governments as the official agent to sell the war bonds in the U.S. When the war began to go badly for them, the Morgan interests began to agitate for every American entry into the conflict, a move which was calculated to save the loans. The Morgan firm also was the official U.S. trade agent for Britain. The violation of international treaty, it handled the purchase and shipping to England of all war material. including the enormous cargo of munitions aboard the Lusitania when she went down. The close relationship between Morgans and Great Britain was no accident. J.P. Morgan Jr. was the driving force behind the Council on Foreign Relations, the American branch of the secret society established by Cecil Rhodes for the expansion of the British Empire. In truth, the Morgans were more British than American. The reason for this is to be found in the origin of the Morgan dynasty. It all began with an American merchant from Danvers, Massachusetts, by the name of George Peabody. In 1837, Peabody traveled to England as a bond salesman for the cheap Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, hoping to find British investors to replace the missing ranks of Americans who, because of a recession at that time, showed little interest in the project. He routinely was rejected by the large investment houses of London, but eventually his persistence paid off. Stanley Jackson, in his biography of Morgan, says of Peabody, when the panic in the US at last started to subside, he called time and again on the big city barons in London to assure them that Maryland and other states would honor their bonds. He also continued backing American securities with his personal funds. Buying at almost giveaway levels, he later reaped a rich harvest. He unloaded most of the Chesapeake and Ohio canal bonds and won a claim back home for returning his $60,000 commission intact to Maryland's merger treasury. And that was from Stanley Jackson, J.P. Morgan, New York Stein and Day, 1983, page 37. It was during this trip that Peabody opened an import-export business at 22 Old Broad Street in London and began to provide loans and letters of credit to many of his shippers. That moved him into the banking business, specializing in transactions between Britain and the United States. It was fortunate timing. This was the beginning of a period of rapid expansion in the United States, accompanied by an insatiable need for investment capital and a plethora of bond issues offering tantalizing rates of return, which were substantially higher than comparable offerings in Europe. Peabody's firm was in an unusual position to exploit this expanding market, and his firm grew rapidly. Peabody never married, and as he advanced in years, began to look for someone to carry on the business. The qualifications for such a position were difficult. First, the man had to be an American by birth in order to appear authentic as the representative of American investments. Secondly, he had to be British by instinct and preference. This included being well educated and with good breeding in order to be accepted by the aristocracy in London's financial world. Third, he had to have knowledge of Anglo-American finance. And fourth, Peabody had to like him. Junius Morgan, selected by Peabody. When the Boston merchant Junius Morgan met George Peabody at a London dinner party in 1850, little did he realize that the elder financier took an immediate liking to him and began discreetly inquire into his background and reputation. This began an extended period of business and social contact that eventually ended in 1854, when Junius moved his family to London and became a full partner in the firm, which eventually became known as Peabody Morgan and Company. In addition to selling bonds in England for American commercial ventures and state governments, the partnership also became the chief fiscal agent for the Union government during the Civil War. And it was during this period that the firm's great profits pushed it into the top echelons of London's financial fraternity. In 1864, Peabody finally retired and completely turned the business over to Junius, who immediately changed the firm's name to J.S. Morgan and Company. Junius' son, John Pierpont, attended the English high school in Boston, but during much of his youth was enrolled in European schools and became engulfed in British tradition. He had been born in the United States, however, and that made him ideally suited to carry on the Anglo-American role played so deftly by Peabody and Junius. It was, excuse me, Excuse me. It was inevitable that the boy would be trained in international finance and groomed to step into his father's shoes. The first move was to find employment for him in 1857 at the New York investment firm of Duncan, Sherman and Company. 7 years later, Junius acquired a competitor New York firm and set his son up as a partner in Dabney Morgan and Company, which became the New York branch of the London firm. In 1871, with the addition of a third partner, Anthony Drexel from Philadelphia, the firm became Drexel Morgan and Company. In 1895, following the death of Drexel, there was a final change of name to J.P. Morgan and Company. A branch in Paris became known as Morgan Har Harges Harget. Ooh, sorry, butchered that. And Company, Americanizing the New York branch. After the unexpected death of Junius in a carriage accident a few years later, it was decided by Pierpont to reshape the image of the London firm to be a more British operation. This would allow the New York branch to represent the American side with less suspicion of being essentially the same firm. By that time, his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., known as Jack by his friends, had already been brought into the firm as partner, and he was to play an important role in the creation of that image. Biographer John Forbes tells us J.P. Morgan Jr. became a partner in the London house of J.S. Morgan and Company on January 1st, 1898. And a fortnight later, with his wife Jessie and their three children, he left New York and took up residence in England for the next 8 years. Morgan was sent to London to do two specific things. The first was to learn at first hand how the British carried on a banking business under a central banking system dominated by the Bank of England. Morgan Sr. anticipated the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in the United States and wanted someone who would eventually have authority in the Morgan firms to know how such a system worked. The second was quietly to look about the city and select British partners to convert the elder Morgan's privately owned J.S. Morgan and Company into a British concern. And that quote was from John Douglas Forbes, J.P. Morgan Jr., Charlottesville, University Press of Virginia, 1981, page 31. This eventually was accomplished by the addition of Edward Grenfell, a longtime director of the Bank of England, as the new senior partner of what became Morgan, Grenfell and Company. But none of this window dressing altered the reality that J.P. Morgan and Company in New York remained more British in orientation than American. And there's a footnote here that says this apparently has not diminished over the years. In December 23rd, 1991, issue of Business Week, page 69, reminds us that the CEO of JP Morgan and Company, Dennis Weatherstone, who lives in Connecticut, was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. A casual reading of events of this period would lead to the conclusion that Peabody and Morgan were fierce competitors of the Rothschilds. It is true they often bid against each other for the same business, but it is also true that almost every biographer has told how the American newcomers to London were in awe of the great power of the Rothschilds and how they purposely cultivated their friendship, a friendship that eventually became so intimate that the Americans were received as the personal house guests of the Rothschilds. The Morgan firm often worked closely with the House of Rothschilds on large joint ventures, but that was and still is common practice among large investment houses. In light of subsequent events, however, it is appropriate to consider the possibility that the arrangement had been worked out in which the Peabody Morgan firm went one step further and, on occasion, became a secret Rothschild agent. Wow. Sounds like a CIA espionage kind of story. Concealed alliance with Rothschild? Some writers have suggested that the clandestine relationship began almost immediately. Oh, sorry, began almost from the beginning. Eustace Mullins, for example, writes, Soon after he arrived in London, George Peabody was surprised to be summoned to an audience with the gruff Baron Nathan May Rothschild. Without mincing his words, Rothschild revealed to Peabody that much of the London aristocracy openly disliked Rothschild and refused his invitations. He proposed that Peabody, a man of modest means, be established as a lavish host whose entertainments would soon be the talk of London. Rothschild would, of course, pay all the bills. Peabody accepted the offer and soon became known as the most popular host in London. His annual 4th of July dinner celebrating American independence became extremely popular with the English aristocracy, many of whom, while drinking Peabody's wine, regaled each other with jokes about Rothschild's crudities and bad manners. Oh, that's kind of mean. Okay. Without realizing that every drop they drank had been paid for by Rothschild. So that quote was from Eustace Mullins, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, Virginia Bankers Research Institute, 1983, page 49. Mullins does not give a reference for the source of the story, and one cannot help being skeptical that such details could be proved. Nevertheless, a secret arrangement of this kind is not as absurd as it may sound. There is no question that the Rothschilds were quite capable of such a clandestine relationship, and in fact, this is exactly the kind of deception for which they have become famous. Furthermore, there was ample reason for them to do so. A strong anti-Semitic and anti-Rothschild sentiment had grown up in Europe and the United States, and the family often found it to its advantage to work through agents rather than to deal directly. Derek Wilson tells us, quote, the name Rothschild was thus beginning to be heard in places far removed from sophisticated London and Paris, but the connection with the great bankers was sometimes tenuous. And that quote was from Derek Wilson, page 176. The tenuous connection was precisely the role to be played by August Belmont in the United States, and the anti-Semitism he found there was undoubtedly the reason he changed his name from Schomburg to Belmont upon landing in New York in 1937. Prior to that, the Rothschild agent had been the firm of J.L. and S.I. Joseph and Company, about as American sounding as one can get. It was not long, however, before the Belmont-Rothschild connection became common knowledge, and the ploy ceased to be effective. In 1848, the family decided to send Alphonse Rothschild to the United States to check on Belmont's operations and to evaluate the possibility of replacing him with a direct Rothschild representative, perhaps Alphonse himself. After an extended visit, he wrote home, in a few years from now, America will have attracted to itself the greater part of trade with China and the Indies and will be enthroned between the two oceans. The country possesses such elements of prosperity that one would have to be blind not to recognize them. I have no hesitation in saying that a Rothschild house, and not just an agency, should be established in America. Today, we are presented with a fine opportunity. Later on, difficulties will of necessity arise as a result of competition from all sides. And that, oh, sorry, that quote was from B. Gill, Histoire de la Maison Rothschild. Sorry, butchered that. That's French. Volume 1, 1965 to 1967, page 581, cited by Derek Wilson, page 181. Some historians have expressed amazement over the fact that the recommendation was never acted upon. Wilson says this was the greatest opportunity the Rothschilds ever lost. And that quote was from Derek Wilson, page 182. Those with a more skeptical bent are tempted to wonder if the opportunity really was lost or if it was merely taken in a more indirect fashion. It is significant that precisely at this time, George Peabody was making a name for himself in London and had established a close relationship with Nathan Rothschild. Is it possible that the Peabody firm was given the nod from the Rothschild consortium to represent them in America? And is it possible that the plan included allowing Belmont to operate as a known Rothschild agent while using Peabody and Company as an unknown agent, thus providing their own competition? John Moody answers, the Rothschilds were content to remain a close ally of Morgan rather than a competitor as far as the American field was concerned. That quote was from Moody, page 27. Gabriel Galco says Morgan's activities in 1895 to 1896 in selling U.S. gold bonds in Europe were based on his alliance with the House of Rothschild. And that quote was from Coco, Triumph, page 190, 142. Sereno Pratt says, these houses may, like J.P. Morgan and Company, represent here the great firms and institutions of Europe, just as August Belmont and Company have long represented the Rothschilds. And that quote was from Serrano S. Pratt, The Work of Wall Street, New York, D. Appleton, 1916, Report, New York, Arnold Press, 1975, page 349. And George Wheeler writes, part of the reality of the day was an ugly resurgence of anti-Semitism. Someone was needed as a cover. Who better than Piermont Morgan, a solid Protestant exemplar of capitalism, able to trace his family back to pre-revolutionary times? And that was from Wheeler, page 17 and 18, and page 42. Rise of the House of Morgan. With these considerations as background, the meteoric rise of Morgan's star over London and Wall Street can be readily understood. It is no longer surprising, for example, that Peabody and Company was the sole American investment firm to receive a gigantic loan from the Bank of England during the U.S. Panic of 1857, a loan which not only saved it from sinking, but made it possible to seize and salvage many of the ships that were then capsized on Wall Street. Peabody had become active in the business of discounting acceptances, which is bankers' language for ensuring commercial loans issued for the purchase of goods. This is how it works. The seller issues a bill with a stipulation that he must be paid at a future date, usually 90 days. When the buyer receives the bill, his bank writes the word accepted across the face of it and adds a signature of an officer, making it legally binding contract. In other words, the bank becomes a co-signer on the buyer's credit and guarantees payment even if the buyer should default. Naturally, there is a price for this guarantee. That price is stated as a percentage of the total bill, and it is either added to the amount paid by the buyer or deducted from the amount received by the seller. Actually, there is a fee paid at both ends of the transaction. One to the seller's bank, which receives acceptance and pays out the money, and one to the issuing bank, which assumes the liability of guaranteeing payment. The sale is said to be, quote, discounted by the amount paid to the banks. And so it was that Peabody and Company had been active in the business of discounting acceptances, primarily between sellers in England and buyers in the United States. Morgan and the Panic of 1857. In the Wall Street Panic of 1857, many U.S. buyers were unable to pay their bills, and Peabody and Morgan were expected to make good on their guarantees. Naturally, they didn't have the money, and the firm was facing certain bankruptcy unless the money could be obtained from somewhere. Stanley Jackson provides the details. The slump was catastrophic for Peabody and Company. It suddenly found itself committed to acceptances of £2 million, and with no hope of discharging even part of a stockpile of depreciating bonds on New York brokers and bankers, themselves now desperately short of ready funds. The firm was soon paying out thousands of pounds a day, Without raising a large temporary loan, the partners would be forced to suspend business altogether. And that quote was from Jackson, page 56. Ron Chernow in the House of Morgan says, rumors raced through London that George Peabody and Company was about to fail, a prospect heartily relished by rivals. The major London houses told Morgan they would bail out the firm, but only if Peabody shut down the bank within a year. And that quote was from Chernow, page 11. Jackson continues the narrative. The clouds lifted dramatically when the Bank of England announced a loan to Peabody of 800,000 pounds at very reasonable interest, with the promise of further funds up to £1 million if and when required. It was a remarkable vote of confidence, as Thomas Hankey, governor of the Bank of England, had already rejected similar appeals from various American firms who did not measure up to his standards. Peabody and Company recovered almost overnight and indeed hoisted its turnover above pre-slump levels. And that was from Jackson, page 56 and 57. With an almost unlimited access to cash and credit backed by the Bank of England, Peabody and Morgan were able to wade hip deep through the depreciated stocks and bonds that were sold to them at sacrifice prices on Wall Street. Within only a few years, when sanity had been restored to American markets, the assets of the firm had grown to gigantic proportions. And that quote was from Josephson, page 60. This event tells us a great deal about relationships. If the Rothschilds truly had been competitors, they would have seized upon this opportunity and used their great influence within the Bank of England and the other investment houses in London to squeeze out Peabody, not to assist him. The Barings, in particular, were already trying to accomplish exactly that. The Rothschilds must have believed that a successful Peabody firm ultimately would be their own best interest. Anti-Semitism was profitable. In later years, Jack Morgan, JP Jr., would assume the role of a staunch anti-Semite, and this undoubtedly strengthened his hand at dealing with American investors and borrowers who were loath to have anything to do with Jewish bankers. That, of course, included officials of the U.S. Treasury. It was particularly helpful during the 1896 rescue of the federal government from a decline in its gold reserves. Fearing that it would not be able to honor its promise to exchange paper money for gold coins, the government was forced to borrow $62 million in gold. The House of Rothschild was an obvious source for such a loan, but the Treasury wanted to avoid an anti-Semitic backlash. Everything fell into place, however, when Morgan and Company became the primary lender, when Rothschild apparently demoted to the role of a mere participant. Wheeler writes, the consummate politicians of the Cleveland administration were certainly aware of the dangers inherent in promoting a rescue effort for the United States Treasury that would be financed by those archetypes of, quote, international Jewish financiers, the Rothschilds. During these developments, Piermont Morgan took no direct part in the salvage effort. Up to this point, it looked as if the aging financier, he would be 58 in 2 months, would be merely one among many in this and whatever subsequent bond arrangements would be necessary. It seemed as though he would move on into old age with little more to round out his obituary than his awkward attempt to profiteer on the sale of rifles at the start of the Civil War, his minor shorting of the Union in gold trading toward the close, and a bold but largely unsuccessful move in the 1880s to impose an Eastern capitalist ceasefire on the country's warring railroads. But there were steps being taken even now to bring him out of the financial backwaters, and they were not being taken by Pierpont Morgan himself. The first suggestion of his name for a role in the recharging of the reserves originated with the London branch of the House of Rothschild. And that quote was from Wheeler, page 16 and 17. The apparent anti-Semitism of J.P. Morgan Jr. was again extremely profitable during World War I when it was widely publicized that the Kaiser was funded by German Jew bankers. To deal with the Morgan Group, therefore, was opposed to Kuhn Loeb, for example, was in some circles almost a point of national patriotism. When J.P. Morgan Sr. died in 1913, people were shocked to learn that his estate was valued at only $68 million, a paltry sum compared to the fortunes held by the Vanderbilts, Astors, and Rockefellers. It was even more unbelievable when Jack Morgan died in 1943 and left an estate valued at only $16 million. A small amount had been transferred to members of their families prior to their deaths, and that did not account for the vast fortunes which they visibly controlled during their lives. Surely there had been a bookkeeping sleight of hand. On the other hand, it may have been true. When Alphonse Rothschild died in Paris in 1905, it was revealed that his estate contained $60 million in American securities. The Rothschilds in Britain undoubtedly held an equally large block. Furthermore, many of these securities were handled through the House of Morgan. And that quote was from C. Head of Rothschilds, Paris House is dead. The New York Times, May 27, 1905, page 9. The possibilities are obvious that a major portion of the wealth and power of the Morgan firm was, and always had been, merely the wealth and power of the Rothschilds, who had raised it up in the beginning and who sustained it through its entire existence. How much of Morgan's apparent anti-Semitism was real, and how much may have been a pragmatic guise, is, in the final analysis, of little importance, and we should not give unwarranted emphasis to it here. Regardless of one's interpretation of the nature of the relationship between the houses of Morgan and Rothschild, the fact remains that it was close, it was ongoing, and it was profitable to both. If Morgan truly did harbor feelings of anti-Semitism, neither he nor the Rothschilds ever allowed them to get in the way of their business. To put the London connection into proper perspective, it would be necessary once again to abandon a strict chronological sequence of events and jump ahead to the year 1924. So let us put our cast of characters on hold for a moment, and before allowing them to act out the drama of creating the Federal Reserve System, we shall pick up the storyline 11 years later after that event had already taken place. Wow. Okay, we will stop there for now. I'm going to mark this so we know where we stopped. Very interesting. Sounds like a story of intrigue and espionage and CIA craft, whatever you call it. Very interesting. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And we will continue our reading next time. And I hope you join us then. In the meantime, you guys all have a great day. All right, bye-bye now.